Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year.
Hello and welcome to Carbon Politics. As countries advance along the green energy transition, electrification has emerged as an important priority. The incoming Turkish Presidency for COP31 has proposed a global target to raise electricity's share in the final energy mix to 35% by 2035 as part of its action agenda. This figure draws from recent analysis by the International Renewable Energy Agency, which talks about how the world needs to achieve 35% electrification by 2035 to stay on track for a 1.5 degree Celsius temperature rise. However, it is important to acknowledge that countries begin this transition from vastly different starting points, which raises the question, can a global electrification target accommodate the development priorities and the economic realities of the Global South? To explore this issue, we are joined today by Dr. Binu Parthan and Dr. Toyo Kawabata from IRENA's Country Engagement and Partnerships Division. Dr. Parthan, Dr. Kawabata, thank you for joining us. Let's jump right in and begin with the first question. Dr. Parthan, if you could help us understand the electrification agenda itself, what sectors, what kind of activities does it cover, and why is electrification becoming such a central agenda in the energy transition discussions?
Thanks very much, Upamanyu, and thanks for this opportunity to share some of IRENA work, knowledge, and perspectives with a larger audience. So electrification fundamentally means that you replace fuels, generally fossil fuels, gas, oil, or solid fuels, including biomass, with electricity at the end-use sector. So these are sectors typically like transport, where you use vehicular transport, rail, etc., and also buildings, primarily where you use fuels for heating and cooking and all of that, and then industry, where a lot of the process heat and other requirements do come from direct use of fuels. So this stems from a traditional IRENA work, which is enshrined in our World Energy Transitions Outlook, that we have a pathway which is aligned with the Paris Agreement. If all our member states and others do follow this pathway, we should still be able to be within the 1.5 degree temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. So electrification, these end-use electrification has always been a component of that. It's just that recently we find this opportunity to highlight this and bring it to the attention of some of the global policy forums such as COP and the G20 and various other forums where our member states do have presidencies. So that's why it's receiving a global public policy programming attention. So the key is really electrification of end users, displacing traditional fuels, etc., and that electricity coming from renewable energy. So increasingly, grids are moving to solar plus storage, wind, hydro, etc. So the whole approach is that over a longer period of time, end use will be electrified, and that electricity will come from renewable energy.
Right. Thank you for that. Dr. Kawabata, if I could bring you in to help us understand IRENA's proposed target when it's discussing a 35% electrification globally by 2035. Could you help us maybe briefly understand what is the thinking behind such a target? And what are the pathways that IRENA is envisioning? What are the global conditions that IRENA would like to see for the world to move towards such a target?
Sure. As we all know, through the Paris Agreement of climate change, countries collectively agreed on limiting global temperature rise to 2.0 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels
Huh.
and pursue efforts to limit it to the 1.5 degree. Then, aligned with this Paris Agreement goal, electricity must account for 35% of global total final energy consumption by 2035
Huh.
and then more than 50% by 2050. So this is a critical milestone to achieve the Paris Agreement goal in 2050. And this is based on IRENA's revised 1.5 degree scenario. That is our energy transition pathway aligned with Paris Agreement goal, as I mentioned earlier.
Huh.
Then, as you see, our projection is seeing a significant role of electricity in delivering energy services towards
Huh.
2050. And if we look at sectoral details, the electrification rate in the building sector can be around 55% by 2035
Huh.
if countries are on track to achieve Paris Agreement goal in 2050. So we expect a lot of electricity demand, increasing electricity demand in space heating and cooling,
Huh.
heat pumps, and also electric appliances. If you look at industry sector in arena scenario, 35% of uh, electrification rate will need to be achieved by 2035. And it is important to electrify the low to medium temperature heat demand, and also we can electrify the industrial process and manufacturing. Compared with industry and building sector, the electrification rate of transport sector will be still a bit low in 2035.
Huh.
We expect to align with the Paris Agreement goal in 2035. Transport sector's electrification rate can be around 15% globally. But then this is a big jump from the current 1% today.
Yeah.
Then towards 2050, it will grow further to the 45% globally. So accelerating electrification in these key sectors like transport, building, and industry will need a lot of support from policies, regulations, financial and fiscal incentives, and also infrastructure plans and development. We
Huh.
need to scale up the electrification in these sectors by installing electrification measures in hot space heating and cooling, as I mentioned earlier, and also we can electrify the heat demand where possible in the industrial process and manufacturing. And in the last decade, we've seen a lot of support for renewable energy deployment and supply. But
Huh.
in the coming phase of the energy transition, we need to see increasing demand side policies to support electrification in these sectors.
Right. Dr. Kawabata, if we can also bring in the developing country perspective here. Developing countries do have diverse energy access and economic development needs. How can developing countries interpret a global electrification target? And can such targets perhaps meaningfully accommodate the diverse national circumstances that different countries face?
Yeah, so the electrification will need to move forward in a way that reflects on the national priorities, circumstances, and
Uh,
capabilities.
right.
The 35 by 35 electrification target is giving a clear direction of global energy transition, but there is a need for each country to tailor their electrification pathway aligned with their national priorities.
Uh,
It is important to respect the principle of so-called CBDRRC, which is
uh,
common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities
uh,
in the light of different national circumstances. countries have contributed to climate change to different degrees, including
Right.
level of historic emissions.
Hmm.
And also countries have different technological, financial, and institutional capabilities to support climate action efforts. Electrification pathway will need to be determined based on national priorities. And also, these electrification will need to contribute to the country's sustainable development, including
Hmm.
poverty eradication, improvement of living standards, and other sustainable development needs. Then developing countries that still have energy access deficit and that have not yet built extensive fossil fuel-based infrastructures
Hmm.
have the opportunity to directly electrify end uses, including transport industry and building sector by using clean electricity.
Hmm.
This will allow countries to meet their development priorities without depending on the inefficient and emission-intensive fossil fuel-based infrastructures. This pathway must be supported through the affordable and reliable electricity supply, decentralized renewable energy systems, stronger grid and storage, and also technology and financial access, such as concessional financial support from international communities.
Right.
And renewable-based electrification shouldn't be viewed as additional burden imposed on developing countries, but should be as development opportunities. But we need to be aware the electrification will make progress differently across regions.
Hmm.
While we proposed 35% by 35 electrification target,
Hmm.
in several developing regions, the electrification may reach well below 35% in 2035. For instance, in IRENA scenario, for some regions like African and Latin American countries, may reach around 26 to 28% of electrification.
Okay.
And also non-G20 countries may reach around 28% similarly if
Right.
we are on track to achieve Paris Agreement goal in 2050. So there are various reasons behind, including the lower electrification rate for the moment, and also resource availability or energy demand patterns and other factors. But nevertheless, in 2050, the electrification will become major energy carrier in all
Hmm.
regions, in line with the Paris Agreement emission pathway. Then, lastly, if you look at nationally determined contributions,
Hmm.
NDCs, which are countries' commitment to the Paris Agreement, there are a growing number of countries are integrating electrification measures in their new NDCs.
Hmm.
This is a very rough and quick review of NDC summits so far, based on my review. Around 2,000 of developing countries mentioned electrification measures in some way in their new
Hmm.
NDCs.
Right.
Transport sector electrification, such as
Hmm.
battery EVs, are the most frequently mentioned measures in their NDCs,
Hmm.
followed by industry and building sectors. So these represent the growing and also broader interest of global south countries in
Right.
electrification.
Hmm.
The falling cost of renewable energy have strengthened the economic competitiveness and viability of clean electricity projects.
Hmm.
Renewables-based electrification can enhance energy security and also economic reliability while avoiding the reliance on the expensive imported fossil fuels. So
Hmm.
electrification can play important role increasingly for global south to pursue the just energy transition and sustainable development. And international support and cooperation is essential in this process.
Right. Thank you for that. I mean, we would definitely concur. Like, international cooperation has to be at the center as we advance this electrification agenda. Dr. Parthan, if I could come to you, to discuss the barriers that developing countries have faced in advancing electrification. As Dr. Kawabata mentioned, they're also bringing in the electrification agenda into their NDC. So there is a sense of commitment. But what about what are the barriers to implementation? And if you could maybe tell us what are the kinds of policies, what kinds of investment flows, and what kind of international cooperation would be required so that developing countries can pursue both decarbonization and development?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. So, as was mentioned by Toyo earlier, renewables does provide the least cost electric power option currently. That is a big plus. But a major barrier is that the health and abilities of the electric utilities in the developing parts of the world. Several of them do not have the technical abilities. A lot of them are not financially solvent. So the health of the utilities and the state of the electrical system, that is a major barrier when we talk about electrification. The other issue is also, we were earlier talking about transport, industry, buildings. So there is a policy fragmentation. So the electrification initiatives does not just limit themselves to the energy sector. You need to look at housing, perhaps. The housing policy of governments would be to probably reduce costs rather than improve the energy performance or electrification. When you come to industry, the objective could be job creation and improve industrial competitiveness rather than electrification, etc. So there is always and of course, the same with transport. So there is a need for integrated policy. Our belief is that electrification does provide a threefold increase in efficiency, so it improves the economic competitiveness. But there are challenges in terms of investments, etc. And if you take a holistic, integrated policy approach, then that's one way to address it.
Right.
The third, of course, is really the fact that countries always look at their local domestic energy endowment. There are countries which do have oil and gas or coal resources, and it is from an energy independence point of view, and sometimes from a pure financial point of view, it makes sense to use those resources as opposed to renewables. And the same thing with biomass in certain parts of the world. Biomass is often not priced properly, it's available free, and people tend to utilize that in the domestic context. So I think the local resource endowment versus the investments in renewables is another challenge. And again, it's very clear that renewable energy does have these advantages, but structurally, there are compulsions or the legacy aspects which need to be addressed. And finally, the affordability issue. So a lot of people do not have access, and when they do have access, then preventing them to go up the energy ladder is really the financial challenges. So there is an opportunity here to have tariffs in a manner that the ones who have the ability pay more, and the ones who are actually getting energized and electrified can pay less according to their ability. So this is the one of the other barriers as well, the affordability. Now there are a lot of, policies on renewable energy, electrification, for example, auctions of, combined round-the-clock auctions of renewables plus storage has really been a best practice for electrification. Appliance standards and labels drive a lot more of electrification. Governments, including in India, have incentivized, say, sectors like electric vehicles, electric induction cooking, etc. So there are, capital subsidy schemes and others which are good practices as well. But then when it comes to the grid and its upgrade, there is a need for long-term, relatively low-cost financing because of the, let's say, not so good financial health of many of the utilities or their lack of credit worthiness. They're not able to borrow at favorable terms. So I think there could be a role for blended finance. There could be a role for climate finance, which could take a bit more of a risk tolerance in some of these investments, creating special vehicles which could buy down some of these first losses, etc. So I think the financing of the grid network and its modernization, digitalization, and also improving the flexibility by integrating storage, etc. That is an area where there's a lot of opportunity for cooperation. Then, of course, there is a need for technical assistance in peer-to-peer exchange of better practices in electrification. As you're probably aware, the European Union just announced last Friday a 46% by 2040. But the European Union member states too have the resources and the capability to do that. But there are examples from Europe that could be peer-to-peer transferred using a platform like IRENA to other member states, which they could adapt and absorb. So I think there's a need for technical assistance, capacity building, sharing of policy, financing instruments, business models, and very importantly, tailoring these to the context of the countries which are actually applying. So that's another major gap, and IRENA will play some role there. And then finally, is the question of skills and workforce leveling up, etc. So electric motors, like what you have in ceiling fans or let's say electric cookers, etc., have been around for a long time. But then when it comes to the charging networks or battery electric vehicles, there are skills which are required. So I think there is a need to upskill workers, create short-term training programs at the vocational and technical education level. There is a need to create more engineering and tertiary courses, etc., and also creating this framework for new skills which are required for electrification and energy transition. This is another area which needs to be addressed. And there are a lot of good examples there. But then the key is really how fast can we move towards 35 in the next 10 years or so. And again, some countries will lead depending upon the capabilities, and other countries will need hand-holding and support. And IRENA will continue to play that role for a large majority of our 173 member states. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that. I think that momentum we're hoping will really catch on as COP31 comes around, and the proposed target can maybe we can see some countries making some implementation-oriented pledges or proposals. But thank you for this very enriching conversation, Dr. Parthan and Dr. Kawabata. Thank you for joining us on this episode.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today's episode, and we'll see you for the next one.